All right, hello and welcome to this training. As you can see from the title, what we're going to be talking about today is the Purpose Antidote. And as you can see from the overview, what we're going to be talking about more specifically is first the overview itself, the discovery protocol, the identity shift, the obsession advantage, the review, and finally your action items for the day or the next few days. Now, before we get started, if you want to work with me one-on-one, then make sure to book a call from the link in the description. If you want this document along with this training, then make sure to join the free community from the link in the description, where we also have weekly coaching calls, by the way, for free. And if you want weekly newsletters on improving in every aspect of your life, meaning health, wealth, love, and self, then make sure to join the newsletter from the link in the description. With that said, let's get started and talk about the discovery protocol. So the reason you might feel stuck, scattered, anxious, unmotivated, pretty much all of that traces back to one structural problem. You don't have a single consuming goal that organizes your days. And without that, well, everything else kind of fills the vacuum. Comfort fills it, distraction fills it, emotion fills it. You end up living reactively and making decisions based on whatever really feels most urgent or least painful in the moment. And then you wonder why nothing really changes week to week. And when that pattern repeats for long enough, you sort of stop seeing it as a pattern and start treating it as just who you are, which honestly I think is one of the most damaging things that can happen. And you probably start more things than you finish, and that's directly tied to the fact that the finish line was never actually defined in any concrete terms. You keep changing plans, shifting focus, picking up new ideas. And the reason is basically that there's no single metric telling you what's working and what isn't. And most weeks you end with more notes, more bookmarks, more half-started things than actual completed outcomes. So if you can't name one specific outcome you're driving towards this month, you're not really running a goal, right? And if you can't name one behavior that you repeat daily in service of that outcome, you're not running a system either. If there's no record, no data, no proof, then honestly, you're just relying entirely on how you feel, which is arguably the least reliable input you have. And each week that passes without a tangible result quietly lowers your self-trust. And you probably won't even notice it really happening. And that lower self-trust makes every future commitment feel heavier than it actually is. And that's how people drift for months, sometimes years, without realizing the drift is compounding underneath everything else they're doing. And the tricky part, really, is that none of this is dramatic or obvious from the outside. It just looks like a normal week for you. You're busy, you're doing things, you're consuming information, but busy and productive are frankly very different words, and most people use them interchangeably without ever checking which one actually applies to their situation. And building on that, here's the thing about vague goals. They're arguably worse than no goals at all. And the reason is that they create the illusion of direction while producing none of the actual results. So a vague goal gives you just enough to feel like you're sort of working on something without ever telling you what to actually do today. So get healthier, for example, doesn't tell you what you'll do when you wake up tomorrow morning, right? Make more money doesn't really tell you what you'll ship this week or who you'll reach out to. I mean, if the goal can't be acted on today in a concrete and specific way, it's never going to actually control your calendar or your behavior. It's just going to sit there as a nice idea. And I think this is the mistake most people have with their goals. It's just literally just a saying for them. Like, yeah, this is what I'm going for. But there's nothing attached to it, nothing concrete. And what you need instead is a result, a time frame, and a minimum daily behavior that feeds that result. You also need a way to track it, something simple, something visible, something you can actually review without making the tracking itself into a whole project. Without those components, you'll honestly just keep negotiating with yourself every single morning about what counts and what doesn't, and the negotiation itself becomes the activity. And you find yourself a few hours later having done absolutely nothing, wondering where the day went. And what really happens over time when this goes unchecked, and I think this is probably the most important part of this whole section, is you start treating the lack of progress as evidence about your character. You build this quiet narrative that maybe you're just someone who can't follow through, someone who starts strong and then fades out. And that narrative doesn't announce itself. It just kind of settles in and starts guiding your decisions from the background. And believe me when I say it, this was me for a long time, because I just knew these things that I wanted to achieve in my head, but they weren't attached to anything. So from there, over time, obviously, the action fades out. I'm not actually taking consistent action on anything because I don't know what the actions that I need to be taking are, because there is no actual tangible result I'm aiming for. And from there, this identity of you're maybe not going to make it, you're maybe not going to achieve the things you want to achieve, starts forming slowly but surely. And that's when the doubt starts creeping in. And when doubt starts creeping in, and if you start believing it, which is even worse, well, if it solidifies, you're guaranteed to not achieve the goals that you want to achieve. So the story you tell yourself about who you are directly shapes what you attempt. If the story says, I always quit, then you'll hesitate to commit fully to anything new. And honestly, that hesitation looks rational on the surface, but it's actually the old pattern protecting itself from being challenged. It's a form of self-preservation in a way. And every time you avoid a commitment or lower your standards to dodge the disappointment, you feed the story and the story gets louder. It's basically a loop, and the only way to break it is to produce evidence that contradicts it, which is essentially what the rest of the training is built to do. Now, the good news though, and I genuinely mean this, is that the story is made of evidence. And evidence can be replaced, right? You can create new evidence. You just need a system that generates new evidence consistently, even in small amounts, and a way to keep that evidence visible so it doesn't get drowned out by the old habits and the old narrative. And that's doable. That's very doable. Now, when direction is missing, emotion basically becomes the decision maker by default, because without direction, there is also no logic, right? There is nothing to point your mind towards. And so emotion becomes the decision maker by default. And this is where the real damage starts to accumulate. You basically start acting just when you feel good, and you stop when you feel bad. And then the results, or more likely the lack of results, feed the next wave of feeling. And that feedback loop is the actual engine of stagnation. And most people don't even recognize it as a loop. They just think it's how life works. And the way it really plays out in practice, and honestly, you've probably lived this exact sequence more time than you'd like to admit, is you delay the hard action because you don't feel ready, and then you feel worse because you delayed, which makes you delay even more, right? And then the delay feels even more justified the next time around. And over time, that loop becomes so automatic that it doesn't even register as a choice anymore. It just sort of feels like how your days go. So naturally, you try to reduce the pressure with something that works fast. Scrolling, food, entertainment, a new plan, a new tool, reworking your Notion dashboard, a new course. The relief is real sometimes, but it's temporary, and the underlying cause stays completely intact. And the next morning starts the exact same way. And I think on some level you already know that while you're doing it. And restarting gets harder every single time you do it. So you carry the memory of every previous attempt that faded out, and that memory creates this hesitation that adds friction to every new start because you've stacked so much evidence. So the cycle doesn't just repeat, it genuinely compounds, because with every cycle you add more evidence to that. And it gets a little heavier each round. And then on top of all of that, if you try to fix everything simultaneously, which, let's be honest, is what most people do when they finally get motivated on that random 1 a.m. Saturday night, you create overwhelm when you do that. And overwhelm has a very specific effect on behavior. It makes your days reactive instead of deliberate. You spend your energy responding to whatever feels most pressing rather than executing on what actually matters. So, health, money, relationships, self-management, they all matter, obviously. But they still require sequencing. You can't do everything all at once, even though some people would make you feel like you could. And to a degree, you can focus on all of them at the same time, but you can be pushing all of them at the same time to new levels, right? One focus window at a time isn't a limitation, honestly. It's a structural requirement for actually making real progress in any of them. And I know that might feel counterintuitive, but it's true. Split attention actually reduces learning speed and follow through in every area you're trying to improve simultaneously. You keep switching contexts, and every switch costs you momentum. And the result basically is weak, scattered progress everywhere and real, meaningful progress nowhere. And that scattered progress actually feels worse than no progress at all, in a way, because you can't even point to one area where things are clearly getting better, and you don't know if there are, you don't know why they're getting better. So you can't even repeat the same process. And eventually, the overwhelm itself becomes the excuse. I have too much going on becomes the reason nothing really moves forward. And that's kind of the final stage of the pressure loop. And it can honestly last months or years if you just let it run unchecked. So, okay, the question becomes, how do you actually choose the one thing to focus on? And the answer, and I think this will surprise you, is simpler than most people expect. You use attention and frustration as data. So what you keep coming back to and what keeps bothering you already contains most of the signal. The job is really just to turn that signal into one clear, measurable outcome you can act on starting tomorrow. So for 1 week, you record what you watch, what you read, what you search for, and talk about most. You don't interpret it while you're recording. That's the important part. You just capture the raw pattern and let it accumulate without filtering or judging any of it. Just observe, basically. Then at the end of the week, you name the top 2 or 3 themes that showed up most consistently. You pick one theme that's most directly useful for your life right now, today, not in some hypothetical future version of yourself, which honestly is where most people get stuck in the selection. Just what can you work on today? And then you convert it into a measurable outcome with a clear finish line. And you translate that theme into a deliverable, like something you can actually complete and point to when it's actually done. So you define what done looks like in plain, specific language with no ambiguity and no wiggle room. Just a clear description of what exists when the work is finished. And this sounds obvious, I know, but you'd be genuinely surprised how few people actually do it. And it really helps to pick the theme that carries some natural urgency, something where the cost of inaction is already accumulating in your life right now. That urgency isn't manufactured motivation or anything like that. It's a structural advantage, and it makes negotiation with yourself much harder, which is exactly what you want. Now, another way into the decision, and honestly, this one works really well for a lot of people, is through your frustrations. You list the recurring friction points across your health, your wealth or money, relationships, and yourself, spirituality, etc. You choose the one with the highest daily or weekly cost, and then you build the goal around reducing or eliminating that specific cost with a defined window of time, right? So one priority creates clean feedback, and clean feedback makes the plan improve faster. And improvement compounds when you're not splitting your attention between 5 different fires at the same time. So it's really that straightforward. So you commit to a window of 30, 60, or 90 days, and you don't renegotiate the window daily. Like, that's crucial. Like, you don't renegotiate the window at all. You just execute daily and review weekly. The window is fixed. The tactics inside it can be flexible, but the window of time is fixed. And honestly, if you still can't choose after going through these exercises what to work on in your life, what like this purpose or goal should be, that's usually a sign. And I see this all the time. that's usually a sign that you're overthinking the decision because you're kind of afraid of choosing wrong. And there's this like opportunity cost. If I work on this, then I'm not working on that. But the truth is that any focus goal will teach you more in 30 days than another month of just thinking about what to work on ever will. So choosing is the first act of discipline, and frankly, the content of the choice matters way less than the act of committing to something just fully and just working on it. And you don't need to find the perfect goal. You really don't. You need to just find a goal that's specific enough to act on today and meaningful enough for you to sustain your attention for 30 to 90 days. That's the entire bar, and most people clear it pretty easily once they stop trying to optimize the decision to death. And others can't even choose that one goal. And as you're watching this, you're most likely already know what you want to work on the next in the next 90 days. You're just not doing it. Once you're actually moving, you'll learn things about yourself and about the problem that you could genuinely never learn from planning alone. And those lessons will make every future goal easier to achieve. Every future window will be more productive. Every future cycle will be a lot more efficient, but you have to be in motion first. The learning lives in the doing. And once you've selected the focus, you just write one sentence that states the result and the reason. And the result is the measurable outcome. The reason is why it matters to you specifically. And I'm not talking about generically, like not in a way that could apply to literally anyone walking down the street. Why do you need more money? Like everybody will just say, I just want more money. Why? Well, to buy more things. Really? Is that really the reason? Everybody, the masses, want money to just buy more things. Is that really the reason why you want more money? Or is that at least the only reason why you want more money? It's a pretty shallow reason. Of course, you're not going to be motivated to get more money, whatever that is. So the reason has to be personal, and it has to be concrete enough that it still holds weight on the days when you absolutely don't feel like showing up. And those days will come, I promise you that. So how do you get to that depth of the real reason why you want this thing? Why do you want this goal? Well, you become a child, essentially. And you keep asking yourself why until you reach a reason you can actually respect and most likely makes you feel a bit emotional. So if you ask why long enough times, you'll most likely get way beneath the shallow answers, the social answers, the ones that sound good in a conversation. And you keep digging until you hit something that feels specific and direct, and honestly, maybe even a bit uncomfortably honest. That depth is what creates real staying power, right? That depth is what creates real fire to actually achieve a goal. Like, why do you want more money? To buy more things. Why? To make myself feel good. Why? Etc. You keep asking. And if the reason sounds like advice you'd give to just anyone, it's not deep enough yet. If it feels like something you'd put on a poster, it's not deep enough. If it changes every few days depending on your mood, it's definitely not deep enough. You're looking for something stable and honest and grounded in your actual life, not some aspirational version of it. So when the reason is genuinely real and personal, you'll notice something interesting. You need way less motivation to act. You'll still feel resistance, obviously, that never fully goes away. Some days you'll just feel like not doing the things you need to do, but you'll stop treating resistance as a vote on whether or not to proceed. The reason sort of overrides that resistance, not by force, but by having clarity about why is it really that you want the thing you want? Why is it really that you want to achieve this goal? And that's a very different experience, in my opinion. And then you set an end date and a weekly target, and the end date forces prioritization because without it, everything feels equally urgent or equally unimportant for that matter. So the weekly target makes progress visible and reviewable. Without both of those, the goal will quietly just drift back into being a vague aspiration, and we're right back where we started that way. So you need an end date and a weekly target that you stay accountable to every single week. So you set a weekly output number or a completion rule, something you can check off without debating whether it counts or not. You just know whether you actually did the thing or not. You keep the rule simple and you make it easy to track. So I would say convert it to some kind of a number. Numbers are easy to track. And yes, you can convert most things into numbers. For most things, you can attach a number goal to them. And the simpler the tracking, honestly, the more likely you are to actually do it consistently. Most people overcomplicate this part and then wonder why they stop tracking after a week or two. So you review once per week, not every hour, not every day. You don't have to do all of that. If you really want to go full speed, you could also try reviewing every day. The weekly review, though, is where you adjust. The daily work is where you execute. So those two modes don't really mix well. And trying to do both simultaneously, if you've never done this before, can create a lot of friction and self-doubt that will slow everything down. So keep them separate. And then you protect the mission from your own tendency to revise it mid-cycle. Like once you've set a goal, this is it for the next 90 days, 60 to 90 days. You can't change it. You can't reduce the goal. So make sure you don't set 10x goals. Actually set a real achievable goal that's just a bit outside of your comfort zone. Attach a number to it that can be tracked. And then you don't revise it for the next 90 days. And you just do the things that will get you to that goal, right? And then you protect the mission from your own tendency to revise it mid-cycle, which honestly almost everyone does. The urge to change the mission usually shows up right when things get a bit uncomfortable, which is exactly when you should not be making any structural decisions about your direction. And that urge is a signal that the work is working, not that the plan is wrong. So to bring this whole section together, the discovery protocol is really just about one thing. You pick one goal, you make it specific and personal, and you attach a number to it. You define the window of time that you're going to achieve it in and the minimum daily behavior, and you lock it in and you can't change it. That's it. That's the foundation everything else in this training is built on top of. And without it, the rest honestly doesn't work. With it, the rest becomes almost mechanical, almost mathematical. The goal itself doesn't need to be revolutionary or life-changing on paper. And I think that's where a lot of people will get tripped up. It just needs to be specific enough to act on, personal enough to sustain and to actually care about, and bounded enough to finish within the window. That's the whole formula. So clarity is the first real advantage you're building here. And it's a bigger deal than it probably sounds. When you know exactly what you're doing and why, the noise goes down and the signal goes up. And you spend less time deciding and more time executing, which is where results actually come from. And everything in the next two sections, the identity shift and the obsession advantage, they all depend on this foundation being solid. So don't rush through it. Get the mission sentence right. Get the reason right. Sit with it for a minute and then move on from there. You start the day after you finalize the mission, not next Monday, not after you finish reading this, the day after. The longer the gap between decision and action, the more room you leave for negotiation and second guessing to kind of creep in and erode the commitment you just made. So early momentum matters way more than early quality, and I really want you to hear that. Like your first week won't be perfect, and it genuinely doesn't need to be. What it needs to be is consistent. Just that first week. Consistency in the first 2 weeks is what builds the base for everything that follows and builds that momentum, right? And you'll see some result. If you do this every day, if you take the action on your goal every day for 2 weeks, you're already going to see some results, and that's going to push you even more. Most people can't even spend 2 weeks on their goals. That's why they feel like they can't achieve anything. And the most important thing you're building in those early days really isn't skill or output or any visible results, even though you're going to most likely get some visible results. It's just trust. Trust in yourself specifically. Trust that when you say you'll do something, you actually do it. That trust is honestly the single most valuable asset in this entire process, and is basically what the next section is entirely about. And it's also the reason why I told you to not set 10x goals, because if you can't reach those goals, those weekly targets based on your 10x goal, you're not going to start trusting yourself, right? How do you expect then to actually achieve further goals that you set afterwards? If you have no trust whether you're actually going to take action or achieve those goals, and you have no trust in yourself, then how do you actually expect to achieve them, really? So set an actual realistic, even though I hate that word, realistic goal, and then go after it. That's just a bit of a reach from what you typically would set for yourself. And then just take action on it and make sure to complete the actions and take those actions every single day, because what happens if you don't? You stop trusting yourself once again. And the next time you set a goal, the same thing will happen, because there's no trust in yourself. You're just going to be using the consistency bias against yourself. So let's talk about the identity shift. So now you've got the mission, you picked the goal, you've defined the reason, you've set the window, and that's the structural part done. And it matters a lot more than most people give it credit for, because without that, well, there is going to be no identity shift. But here's where most people run into what I'd call the real problem, and it's something that honestly doesn't get talked about nearly enough. The issue isn't most of the times the plan, is that you're still relying on motivation to execute the plan. Well, that should be to a degree fixed with getting the real reason behind the goal. But motivation by its nature is unstable. It changes daily, sometimes hourly. And if your execution really depends on how you feel, your output becomes just as unstable as your mood, and unstable output over weeks and months just doesn't build anything lasting. It genuinely can't. So this section is going to be about replacing motivation with identity, which basically means building a self-concept that's rooted in evidence rather than intention, rather than vague wishes. That's the whole idea. And the rest of the section is really about how you actually do it. So most people treat motivation like it's a prerequisite for action. Like you need to feel a certain way before you can actually sit down and actually do the work. And the problem with that is pretty obvious once you look at it honestly, is that your feelings change constantly, right? My feelings will most likely change in the next 10 minutes. So your output changes constantly as well. And inconsistent output over weeks and months, as we said, doesn't build anything real. So when action depends on mood, you start and stop and start and stop, essentially. And when you do that repeatedly over time, you never actually build any real skill in the thing you're working on, right? You just can't. The work stays effortful and slow because you never really reach a point where it becomes familiar and fluid and kind of automatic. You're perpetually in the hard early phase. Slow results make you question the plan, and then questioning makes you change the plan, and then changing the plan resets whatever small momentum you'd managed to build, and then you're back to day one again, carrying less confidence than you had the last time around, and less self-trust. It's genuinely exhausting, and I think you probably know exactly what I'm talking about here. And each reset quietly reduces, as I said, your self-trust, and honestly, this is the part that does the most damage. Lower self-trust makes the next commitment feel heavier and riskier, and eventually you just stop committing fully to anything in your life, not because you're lazy. It's really not about laziness, but because you're protecting yourself from the feeling of another failure. You're basically protecting yourself from yourself. And the really frustrating part of all of this, and I mean genuinely frustrating, is that you already know what you need to do. The information isn't the bottleneck. The bottleneck is that you're kind of trained yourself to hesitate, and hesitation has become the default response to anything that requires any effort from you over time. And the other thing that happens when the minimum isn't defined clearly, and this is something I don't think people realize they're doing, if you don't specify exactly what done looks like for each day, you'll negotiate with yourself every single morning. Like, should I do more? Can I do less? Is this enough? Like, that negotiation will drain your energy before the actual work even starts. And on low energy days, the negotiation always wins, always. So the fix is actually pretty simple: a daily minimum and an optional extension. The minimum is the contract. You do it no matter what. It's like your daily minimum standard. The extension is a bonus for high energy days, but the minimum is sacred. Like you treat it as non-negotiable and is the only thing you hold yourself accountable to on bad days. Everything else is extra. So to give you an example, with a very simple goal, let's say you want to read a book a week and you've attached a number to it. You've calculated that you need to read 50 pages a day to be able to read a book a week. Well, your minimum in that case should be something like 40 pages or 30 pages, let's say. And your extension should be like 60 pages. So on higher energy days, or when you feel more like reading, you'll go for 60. And on lower ones, you'll go for 40. And over the course of the week, you're most likely going to end up somewhere in between. And that minimum, as I said, is sacred. So you also need to define when you stop for the day, which honestly, most people never even really think about. If the work has no endpoint, and this is something that even advanced entrepreneurs and people that are actually very productive have a problem with, is that their work has no endpoint. There is no end of the day. And if you have no endpoint, it kind of expands in your mind and creates avoidance because you start dreading something that technically never finishes. And if there's no end, you wouldn't start anything, right? You wouldn't start something that you don't know when it will end. And a human being can withstand and go through anything as long as they know that there's an end. So you define the floor and the ceiling, and you operate within that range. It sounds small, but it makes a real difference for your productivity. It also creates this natural bracket of time in which you actually work. And whether you believe it or not, that actually increases your productivity. Knowing that your work ends at a certain point will increase the productivity you have in that time, right? Because you now know when it will end. So you have this deadline essentially every single day towards which you're basically working. So work expands the time we give it, right? So expands to fill the time we give it. So if there is a deadline every single day, if there is a clear deadline of when we stop working every single day, we're actually going to be more productive. Otherwise, we're just going to drag on the same task until bedtime. And the thing that makes all of this so urgent once you really understand it, and I want to be pretty direct about this, is inconsistency does more damage over time than any single mistake ever could. A mistake you can correct, right? A bad day you can recover from easily. But weeks and months of starting and stopping on anything will just erode something much deeper, which is your core belief that you can actually follow through on what you say you'll do. And without that belief, nothing is possible, really. Once that belief erodes far enough, that's when things get genuinely hard to turn around. So what happens gradually, and this is kind of insidious, honestly, is that you lower your own commitments preemptively so that you can't be disappointed when things don't work out. Basically, you stop setting deadlines, you stop setting goals, you stop making specific promises to yourself, and you frame all of this as being quote unquote realistic or quote unquote flexible. But what it actually is, if we're being straight about it, is avoidance dressed up in more respectable language. You stop attempting what you actually want. You just settle for what feels safe. And this is how most people live, right? And the gap between what you want and what you're willing to attempt grows wider every single month. And that gap is basically where regret accumulates slowly and quietly until it becomes the background noise of your whole life. And you don't even notice it happening. That's the really tricky part. You get to the end of your life and you realize that you haven't done anything. So months pass and the core problem stays exactly the same. You become familiar with the pattern. You might even, in a weird way, become kind of comfortable with it. But familiarity isn't the same as acceptance, and comfort isn't the same as peace. It's really just delay with a lower heart rate, if I'm being honest. And reversing this pattern takes real, tangible evidence, not a new plan, not another book or a video course, actual verifiable evidence that you did what you said you'd do day after day, even when it was hard. That's the only thing that genuinely rewrites the story we talked about back in the discovery protocol, and nothing else really touches it. Now, without a stable routine producing daily evidence, small setbacks feel much larger than they actually are. And this is something that kind of catches people off guard. You don't have consistent proof that you're moving forward, so any friction or disruption feels like evidence that the whole thing is really falling apart. And without counter evidence to challenge that feeling, well, the feeling just wins every single time. So the typical response is one of two extremes, and honestly, you've probably done both at different points. You either push way too hard for a few days out of guilt, or you quit entirely and tell yourself you'll start again when conditions are better, when you have the perfect conditions. And both responses break that continuity. And continuity, like we established in the last section, is basically the core requirement for building anything lasting. Or you try to fix the feeling with more input, more content, more planning, more research, more restructuring of your Notion dashboard. But input without output is really just a more sophisticated form of avoidance. And it feels productive, which honestly is what makes it so dangerous, which actually makes it harder to catch and harder to stop. So the shift is this: you stop waiting to feel ready, because let's be honest, ready never really arrives, and you build a system that makes action automatic regardless of how you feel on any given day. You design your days so that the minimum behavior happens whether you're motivated or not. And then over time, the record of that behavior changes how you actually see yourself. That's the identity shift right there. It doesn't come from affirmations or visualization, even though that could help, or positive thinking. It comes from evidence, plain and simple. So you attach the daily work to a fixed time or a fixed trigger, something that already happens reliably in your day without you having to really think about it. And you remove the need to decide each time, which is honestly half the battle. And the cue starts the action, and the action follows the cue without negotiation or deliberation. So you pick a time you can repeat on most days, not the ideal time, not the optimal time, just a repeatable time. And if the time changes occasionally, you keep the trigger constant at least. Consistency needs a stable start signal, and honestly, the start signal matters way more than the exact position on the clock. So you prepare the environment before you need willpower. You set things up so that starting the work is the path of least resistance in that moment. You remove obvious distractions, you make the default behavior the productive one, and that's basically it. It sounds small, I know, but it's genuinely one of the highest leverage moves you can make in this whole process. And just to connect this back to what we discussed earlier in the selection process, because it's basically the same thing, you're doing the same thing here, right? You're reducing the cost of the right action and increasing the cost of the wrong one. That's the whole game there. Willpower is a backup system. It's not the main engine you should be running on. Willpower is for the days where your systems aren't really working. So the minimum is honestly the most important part of the entire system, and it's also the part people are most tempted to skip or inflate when they're feeling ambitious, like the 10x goals, which in my experience is exactly when they shouldn't be touching it. You protect the minimum above all else. You do it on tired days, you do it on bad days, you do it on days when everything else falls apart, and you do it on the best days of the best of best days, right? The minimum is a behavior you fully control. It doesn't depend on outcomes, other people, or favorable conditions. This keeps you honest, and it keeps the streak alive even when the external circumstances are kind of working against you. And that matters more than people realize. That minimum has to be something that you actually hold yourself accountable to. The streak matters, but not for the reason most people think. It's not about ego or a number on a calendar app. It's about continuity. Continuity is what builds momentum, and momentum is what eventually makes the work feel less expensive and less effortful. So, as I've talked about in other videos of mine, it's really about returning to the thing. And if your minimum is like a 10x goal, you're never going to return to the thing. So, that's the real payoff of protecting the streak. It gets easier, genuinely easier. And so keep the minimum genuinely simple. If your minimum requires 90 minutes in perfect conditions, it's really not a minimum, right? A real minimum can be done in 15 to 20 minutes on your absolute worst day, maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour, depending on what your work capacity is. That's the standard it needs to meet. If it doesn't pass that test, then just shrink it until it does. And there's no shame in that. The whole point is that it's doable no matter what. The whole point is that it's a minimum, it's a floor. And once the cue, the minimum, and the environment are all in place, you basically built a daily ritual. Not in some crazy sense, nothing like that, but just in the practical sense that you've created a repeatable sequence that runs without requiring any fresh motivation or any motivation at all each morning. And the ritual does the heavy lifting so your willpower doesn't have to. And that's honestly a pretty beautiful thing once it clicks, right? Each repetition strengthens the path a little more. The first week feels deliberate and effortful, maybe even a little forced, maybe a bit hard. And that's totally normal. The third week feels familiar. By the sixth or seventh week, it just sort of feels like what you do, and you've built that self-trust in yourself. That transition from effort to identity is the whole point of this section. That's the shift. And the effects compound in ways you genuinely can't see during the first few days. Skill improves, confidence builds, resistance drops. The work gets better and easier simultaneously, but you only reach that compounding stage if you protect the early repetitions, which is why the minimum matters so much up front. You're basically buying yourself a ticket to the easier phase if you make the minimum a minimum. So try to track completions rather than what you intended to do. You count days done, not hours planned or ideas brainstormed or content consumed. The record is simple, visible, and factual. You review it weekly and then adjust one variable at a time. And this is where the evidence actually lives. And the evidence is what ultimately rewrites the story you've been telling yourself so far, maybe for years at this point. So the record becomes your proof that you can follow through, and proof, as I said, is the only thing that actually reduces that internal debate about whether you're that kind of person or not. Proof doesn't argue or persuade. It just sits there and accumulates until the old narrative can't really compete with it anymore. It's quiet, but it's powerful, and you can always point to it, right? So anytime you start doubting yourself and asking yourself, am I really that person? You can just point at that. So keep the record somewhere you can actually see it every day, not buried in an app you rarely open, not in some spreadsheet you forget about, somewhere visible and pretty much unavoidable. Or make it a daily routine to actually look at that spreadsheet. So the visibility reinforces the behavior, and the behavior reinforces the identity. That loop is basically the engine of real, actual identity change, and it's surprisingly simple once you set it up. And don't overcomplicate the tracking itself. And I say this because almost everyone does. A simple check mark or a number is way more important than trying to, like, who knows what, do all of it at the same time. A simple check mark or a number is more than enough. If the tracking system becomes its own project with color codes and dashboards, you've kind of lost the plot, right? The work is the priority. The tracking is just there to capture the evidence that you've done the work. That's it. And when you miss a day, and you will miss days, that's just reality, you return the next day to the task and do the minimum, full stop. Fast return is the skill. I've talked about this on other videos. It's not about trying to do every day perfect. It's not about unbroken streaks. It's just about returning to the task as quickly as possible. That's what really genuinely separates people who build real lasting momentum in any area from people who keep chronically restarting. In relationships, you have to recommit to your significant other basically every day, at the very least every week. In the gym, you have to return to the gym every week. Even if you fall off, you have to return to it, right? It's about returning. It's not about these unbroken streaks. That's not the point. The speed of your return after a miss is honestly more important than the miss itself. I really want that to land. A 1 day gap barely registers over the course of a full window. And over the course of 5 years, it doesn't really matter at all. A 1 week gap, though, can start eroding your confidence and momentum in real measurable ways. The goal is always to minimize the gap between the miss and the return. That's it. That's the whole skill. So the quicker you realize that you're in the gap, then the quicker you need to get yourself to return. And this is where a lot of people get stuck because they beat themselves up after missing, and then the guilt kind of becomes its own form of avoidance that delays the return even further, which is sort of ironic when you really think about it. So the rule is, you notice the miss, you don't dramatize it, you don't get in your feelings, you show up the next day and just do the minimum. And if you've missed your minimum for weeks on end, or even just a week, you can reduce that minimum to get you started. That's the entire recovery protocol, nothing more. So if you keep missing the same day or the same trigger repeatedly, well, that's actually useful information. It means that the system needs a small adjustment, not that you need more discipline or willpower. So adjust the cue, the timing, or the environment and keep the mission the same. Just adjust the system. This is how you optimize a system. You notice where it breaks and then you fix the leakages, right? The system bends, the direction holds. Now, you also actively reinforce the new identity by tracking small wins each day, like confirmations that you are actually becoming this person. Not to hype yourself up or manufacture some artificial confidence, nothing like that, just to correct the built-in bias that most people have towards noticing what went wrong and completely ignoring what went right. And that bias is strong and deeply ingrained in most people, more than you probably realize. And it generally needs a deliberate counterweight if you want the identity shift to actually take hold. We are constantly on the lookout for the things that didn't go right, for the things that we failed at. But noticing the opposite, noticing our wins, noticing what we did right, actually makes us win more. In the winner effect in that book, the author basically suggests that, or shows research that proves that winners tend to win more when they feel like they're winning. And the only way to feel like you're winning is by noticing that you're actually winning, right? So every night you write down 3 specific wins from the day. They have to be factual and concrete. Things you did that required effort, restraint, or consistency, or anything for that matter, just anything positive you did. And it can be big or small. It can be the smallest thing. You keep it short and you don't like edit it or add commentary. You just add the facts. That's what makes it work. So at least one win should relate directly to the mission. At least one should relate to discipline or consistency in some form. And the third can be honestly anything that genuinely required you to show up and do something difficult. Now, this keeps the practice balanced and also connected to the bigger picture you're building towards. And over time, and this is really the cool part, honestly, the small daily practice actually shifts your expectations in a way that's hard to describe until you actually experience it. You start expecting follow through from yourself. Every morning, you actually expect wins from yourself. And you feel like you're winning. You feel like you have momentum just because you're noticing that you have momentum. Just because you're noticing your wins. So you start expecting follow through from yourself. You actually expect yourself to, well, tonight when I'm actually journaling, I will have to write out 3 wins. So let me get those wins. So the more you have, the better. And that expectation really just changes your behavior in subtle but genuinely powerful ways. You hesitate less, you negotiate less, you just do the thing. It becomes kind of automatic. And you increase the difficulty or volume only after you have stability. Only after stability is proven over multiple weeks, not when you feel excited or motivated in some random evening. That's actually the worst time to escalate. Not when you have a particularly good week. After the record shows consistent execution across several weeks, that's the signal to escalate, and honestly nothing else is. So you increase one variable at a time. It's either volume, duration, or complexity. Never all 3 simultaneously. You just keep the minimum stable while you build capacity above it. So this prevents the kind of overreach that leads to collapse and will get another restart, which is the last thing we want at this point, right? So you plan the rest as part of the system. you have to recover, right? There should be rest days, not as something you earn by burning out. Scheduled rest protects your system's longevity over months and years. And unscheduled rest is usually just a crash followed by guilt and another slow restart. So there's a genuinely meaningful difference between those two things, and most people don't learn it until it's too late. Most people push themselves until they burn out, and then there's guilt that they've burned out. There's guilt that they can't return to the task because they've burned out. And all of that is unnecessary. You could have prevented all of that if you just planned some rest. That's all. And James Clear put it well in Atomic Habits when he wrote, "You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems." That's essentially what this entire section has been about, really, right? The system carries you when motivation doesn't, and the record proves that the system is working even on the days when it honestly doesn't feel like it. That's all. Now, with that covered, let's talk about the obsession advantage. So now you've got the mission from the discovery protocol, and you've built the daily system from the identity shift. And those two pieces together give you direction and consistency, which is honestly a lot more than most people ever actually establish. But the last piece, and I'd argue this is the one that really ties the whole thing together, is understanding what actually happens when you stay locked in for the full window and why that sustained focus kind of replaces most of the negative patterns you've been dealing with. So this section is about the compounding effect of obsessive direction and how it handles difficulty, how it crowds out distraction and bad feelings structurally rather than just psychologically, and why the cycle itself becomes your biggest long-term advantage. So it's worth paying close attention to this one. And I say structurally deliberately because that's the key distinction here, right? This isn't about thinking your way out of the hard stuff. It's about building the conditions under which the hard stuff sort of loses its grip. That's a very different mechanism, and it works way better in practice. So when direction is weak or absent, emotions and distractions basically take over your attention by default. And this is something you can probably verify from your own experience right now. If you're being honest with yourself, right? You spend your time responding to whatever feeling is loudest in the moment rather than executing on what actually matters. And this fragments your day in a way that keeps your baseline mood low and your confidence kind of stagnant day after day after day. So without a clear priority running the show, small impulses sort of become decisions. You lose hours to minor choices that don't move anything really forward. And then by the end of the day, you feel behind even though you are technically busy the entire time. And honestly, that's one of the most frustrating feelings there is, which creates stress and feeds the same pressure cycle we talked about in the first section. So fragmented days reduce deep work. Reduced deep work reduces meaningful results, and reduced results increases doubt and whether the plan is actually working or whether you're just wasting your time. So the fragmentation doesn't just waste hours, it actively undermines your confidence in the whole process. And that's the real problem, right? That doubt then increases avoidance. Avoidance increases drift. Drift keeps you stuck. And then the spiral continues in that same loop until something structural changes, which is exactly what a consuming goal provides when you actually commit to it and stay consistent and committed for long enough. That's the key part. And the thing to really understand here, and I think this might be the most important reframe in this whole training, honestly, is that this isn't some kind of weakness. It's just what happens when there's no organizing principle for your attention. Your brain fills the empty space with whatever is easiest and most stimulating in the moment. And that's the default setting. The goal overrides that default, that's all. So if you don't know the very next action you should take, you'll pretty much always gravitate towards whatever requires the least effort, because your brain will always go for the path of least resistance. So it will go for whatever requires the least effort and provides the most immediate relief. So it's just how human attention operates in the absence of any strong goal or strong directional pull. It's kind of how we're wired. And Some of those things are scrolling on your phone. Some of those things are junk food, right? This is exactly why you need one priority that outranks mood and outranks distraction consistently. Because without that, every moment becomes a fresh negotiation between what you should do and what you feel like doing. And the feeling almost always wins those negotiations, almost always. And that priority has to be written down and physically visible in your environment. And I really can't stress this enough. Like, if it lives only in your head, it shifts and morphs with your emotions throughout the day. Written and visible means fixed and stable. That small difference has genuinely outsized effects on your daily follow through and consistency. So, difficulty is coming, and that's not pessimism or fear-based thinking or anything like that. That's just the nature of doing anything meaningful for over a 30 to 90-day window. You will have bad days. You will have bad weeks. You will have unexpected disruptions. You will have family problems. You will have moments where quitting feels completely reasonable and honestly even kind of smart. And if you haven't planned for that in advance, difficulty becomes a reason to stop rather than a thing you already expected and already have a protocol for. So here's the typical sequence that plays out for most people. And honestly, you've probably lived some version of this yourself. You hit a hard stretch, you start waiting for it to pass, the waiting turns into negotiation, the negotiation turns into delay, the delay turns into another restart, and then you're back at the beginning of the loop, carrying more baggage and less confidence than before. So each restart makes the goal feel less real and less achievable in your own mind because you've literally restarted it 1,000 times at this point. And when the goal feels less real, distractions start to seem more reasonable and more justified as alternatives. And that's the inflection point where most people quietly give up without ever officially deciding to. So the other common response is overcorrection, where you push unrealistically hard for a few days to make up for lost time, and then you burn out and crash harder than before, both responses of which the quiet quit and the overcorrection break continuity. And like we established in the identity shift section, continuity is basically the non-negotiable foundation everything else sits on. So a real burnout, the kind that actually stops people for months at a time, rarely comes from doing too much focused work on one thing. It usually comes from unstable patterns, poor recovery, and the constant emotional cost of restarting over and over and over again. You keep paying the discomfort tax of the early days without ever reaching the stage where the work gets easier and starts compounding. That's genuinely exhausting. That will lead you to a burnout. Every restart means you pay the upfront cost again and again without collecting the long-term benefit that it was supposed to give you, that was supposed to follow. You invest the hardest effort repeatedly and then abandon the position right before it would have started paying off. That pattern, sustained over months, creates genuine exhaustion, and most people are wondering why. It also creates disillusionment that runs much deeper than ordinary tiredness. And it's a different kind of tired, right? And eventually, sort of without you noticing it, you stop believing that effort actually even leads to results. You start thinking that effort is all you get. And that belief is quiet and it rarely announces itself directly, but it shapes every single decision you make from that point on. Is the real cost of inconsistency, and it's far more expensive than any single failure or setback could ever be. Now, the good news is, and this genuinely good news, is that the solution is already in place if you follow the earlier sections carefully. The minimum protects you from overcorrection. The weekly review catches problems before they become full-blown crisis. And the defined window prevents you from overcommitting or committing to something indefinite, which is honestly where real burnout actually lives and thrives, when there's no end in sight. So instead of reacting to difficulty when it shows up, which is what most people do basically by default, you use the consuming goal as the organizing principle for your attention, your energy, and your daily decisions going forward. Difficulty is expected, planned for, and handled through tactical adjustments rather than through emotional reactions. And the direction stays stable even when the conditions around you really, truly don't. Right? So you decide in advance what you'll do on bad days and low energy days. You define the minimum behavior for those days specifically. You define recovery rules for low capacity weeks. All of this is written down before you need it so that when the bad day actually arrives, and it will, you don't have to make a decision under pressure. You just follow your SOP, your standard operating procedure, your protocol that you've already built. That's the whole point. You write the bad day plan right next to the mission sentence where you can see both of them together. You keep it simple and immediately executable without any thinking or decision making required. This basically removes the single biggest risk point in the entire system, which is making structural decisions about your direction while you're emotionally compromised or exhausted. And honestly, most bad decisions happen in exactly that state. And a lot of people are actually very good at time management and don't not that good at energy management. And this basically teaches you that. This basically prevents any of those low energy days from getting into your head and basically requiring you to stop your pursuit of the mission entirely. And when disruption happens anyway, and like I've said multiple times now, it will happen regardless of how well you plan. That's just life. The only thing that matters is the speed of your return to the minimum. Not the size of the disruption, not how you feel about what happened, just how quickly you get back to the daily behavior. So fast return, like we've talked about throughout this whole training, is generally the skill that separates real builders from chronic restarters. And you respond to setbacks with concrete adjustments, not with stories or extended self-analysis about what went wrong and why. You change the environment, the schedule, or the minimum action. You keep the mission constant for the full duration of the window. The mission doesn't change because you had a bad week. Only the tactics might. Only the strategies might. And that distinction, honestly, is worth really sitting with. You don't change your mission. Imagine if companies just changed their mission all the time based on their moods, based on having a bad week, bad sales week. When something goes wrong, you identify the cause in plain specific terms and not like I'm unmotivated or I just don't have the discipline. Those are feelings, not really causes. They're not even feelings, they're just blame and shame. The cause is usually something pretty concrete, like the timing was wrong, or the environment had too many distractions, or the minimum was set a bit too high for a bad week. Specifics give you something you can actually fix on the next round, right? You review weekly and change one variable based on what you observed. You measure the effect for the following week, and you keep the rest of the system stable while you test the adjustment. This is honestly the same approach used in any serious performance context, and it works here for exactly the same reason. Controlled iteration beats wild experimentation every single time. I've seen it again and again. So the key insight here, and this is the one people really tend to get backwards, is that stability is not rigidity. You're not stubbornly clinging to a plan that clearly isn't working. You're holding the direction steady, the mission, the overall mission, while adjusting the tactics and the plan within the window. That distinction matters enormously. So here's something that honestly doesn't get talked about nearly enough in any of the self-development material out there, and it's probably the most powerful idea in this entire training. When you run a consuming goal correctly with a minimum and the tracking and the weekly review all in place, it actually replaces most of the negative feelings you've been trying to manage separately this whole time. The anxiety, the restlessness, the low-grade dissatisfaction. Those things don't require their own interventions when your days are organized around something meaningful, something that gives you literal meaning and purpose, and measurable. The goal kind of crowds them out structurally, which is a very different mechanism than trying to think your way out of those feelings. A consuming goal occupies the same mental and emotional space that anxiety and rumination usually fill throughout the day. An I don't mind is the devil's workshop, is how they say it, right? When you know exactly what you're doing today and exactly why it matters, there's simply less room for the noise. This isn't related to positive thinking in any way, or I'm not reframing any of that stuff. It's basically just resource allocation, because now your attention goes somewhere. And if you don't direct it deliberately, your feelings will direct it for you. But if you have a goal, your attention is going somewhere. That's just how it works. The calm that comes from having a clear direction and actually taking action on it consistently and looking at the numbers and seeing that you're improving is fundamentally different from the calm people try to create through relaxation techniques or mindset exercises or breathing routines. It's not something you generate or manufacture. It's something that kind of emerges naturally when the chaos of indecision and ambiguity is removed from your day. Structure creates calm, right? Discipline is freedom, like Joko Willink used to say. Honestly, I think this is one of the most underappreciated ideas in self-development. And the deep focus that comes from sustained daily work on a single goal produces a kind of satisfaction that scattered effort across many areas genuinely never can. There's a weight and a groundedness to it that you can actually feel in your day. And that feeling is what most people are really chasing when they say they want to feel better or be happier or find their purpose. It's not some grand revelation. It's the quiet result of just organized daily action towards something meaningful to them. That's it. Confidence is the downstream effect of evidence, and honestly, nothing more than that, right? You produce evidence through the daily minimum, you track it through the record, you review it weekly, and over time, you stop needing to psych yourself up or watch motivational content before you act. You just kind of expect to follow through, and then you do. Like, I personally don't have to think about the things I'm doing every day. I just do them. That's real confidence. That's just confidence in myself in terms of following through on things that I've said I will follow through on. And it's completely different from the temporary high of a good video or an inspiring quote on Instagram, which, let's be honest, wears off in 30 minutes. Real confidence is quiet and steady. It doesn't need to announce itself or prove itself to anyone, including you. It comes from a stack of days where you did what you said you'd do, and it stays stable even when conditions get hard or circumstances shift around you. Right? That stability is honestly the entire point of everything this training has been building towards. And the confidence you build in one area transfers directly to others, which is maybe the best part of all of this. When you prove to yourself that you can sustain focused effort on one goal for 30, 60, or 90 days, that proof applies everywhere else in your life. Focus is focus, it just transfers, right? The next goal feels lighter, the next commitment feels more natural, the next window starts from a higher baseline. That's the compounding effect of discipline across time, and it's very, very real. So when you complete the window, you don't just stop and let the structure dissolve, which honestly is what a lot of people instinctively do. They feel like, oh, I've completed the goal, time to relax and do all sorts of bad things. You set the next target quickly, not immediately, but quickly. You take a few days to rest, review what happened, to gather your lessons, and then you define the next mission and the next window. You keep the cycle active so that direction never disappears for long enough to let the old patterns and the old drift sort of creep back in. You gotta set the new goal, right? The full cycle is mission, minimum, tracking, weekly review, and then the next mission. You keep it repeatable and sustainable across months and years, and over multiple cycles, the process becomes more natural and requires way less deliberate effort each time. And that's honestly the real advantage of systems thinking over motivation thinking. The system improves even when you don't particularly feel like improving. So you develop a rhythm where focused work and intentional rest alternate in predictable and sustainable patterns. That rhythm protects your energy and prevents the kind of burnout that comes from open-ended, indefinite commitment with no structure, and it just feels better, honestly, right? There's a steadiness to it. And each new cycle builds on what you learned in the one before it. Your goals get sharper, your system gets tighter, your capacity grows. The person running cycle 5 looks very different from the person who started cycle 1. And that transformation happened through accumulation and repetition, not through any one big action, right? Or some kind of a breakthrough moment. It's quieter than people expect, but it's also more real. And over time, your record becomes your standard. The standard reduces daily negotiation. The minimum that once felt challenging and required a lot of effort now just feels normal, and you've raised it accordingly based on what the data actually showed. And that slow, steady escalation is really how real, lasting change actually happens in practice, not in big breakthroughs, in the quiet accumulation of done days, right? That's it. That's the whole secret, honestly. It's just having enough of those days. And this is where the whole training kind of comes full circle, right back to the identity shift from the previous section. You're no longer someone who's trying to change. You're someone who has a track record of following through. And it changes what you attempt, what you expect from yourself, and how you respond to difficulty when it inevitably shows up. And it happened without any grand transformation, right? It just happened with a small daily actions, just daily work tracked and reviewed. The system belongs to you. The record belongs to you. The evidence belongs to you. Nobody can take that away or argue with it or diminish it. And that's honestly the real antidote to every feeling that's been holding you back. Just proof, stacked daily, reviewed weekly, compounded over time. That's genuinely all it takes. So the final point, and it's honestly the simplest one in this entire training, you commit to one window at a time. You don't change the mission because you got uncomfortable or bored or distracted by something that seems shinier and more exciting. And honestly, something shinier always shows up right around week 3. You only change the mission if you learn something genuinely decisive that makes the current goal obsolete. Otherwise, you stay and you finish the window. You treat the window as a contract with yourself that you actually honor. You do the minimum daily. You use the weekly review to adjust tactics, and you let the window run its full course before making any structural changes to the direction. That's the deal you make with yourself. So you define in advance what counts as a miss and what counts as recovery. You don't improvise the rules in the moment when you're tired or frustrated or demoralized. And that's exactly when you'd be most tempted to bend them, by the way, in your own favor in ways that honestly actually are not in your own favor over the long term and undermine the whole system. At the end of the window, one of two things happens. Either you hit the target or you produce enough data and enough self-knowledge to make the next cycle significantly better and sharper. Both of those outcomes are wins, genuinely. There is no version of a fully completed window that's a waste of your time. None. The only waste of time is actually not completing the window. After the window ends, and only after it ends, you raise the standard for the next one. Not during the current window when emotions are running high or you're feeling motivated or something, or you watched a motivational video. Not when you're feeling ambitious on a good day. After the record proves with actual evidence that you've got the capacity for more, right? The same way as going to the gym, you're not going to start lifting 200 pounds on the bench press unless you've already lifted 195. In the same way, right? You choose one variable to increase for the next window, just one, and you keep the rest stable. You test the new standard for a full cycle before changing anything else. You don't trade sleep, health, or basic well-being for short-term output, right? That's not discipline. That's honestly just a different, more socially acceptable form of self-sabotage. And it always catches up with you eventually. So with that said, let's go over the review. We talked about the overview, the discovery protocol, the identity shift, the obsession advantage, the review, and finally your action items for the day or the next few days. Write 1 30, 60, or 90-day mission sentence with a measurable result, a personal reason, and an end date, and finalize it today so that execution begins tomorrow without any further planning or deliberation. Then set a daily minimum behavior, attach it to a fixed cue and prepared environment, and track completions for 14 consecutive days without changing the mission, adjusting only the tactics during your weekly review, and then run a full weekly review at the end of each week. Change one variable based on what the data actually shows, and repeat the cycle until the window ends, then set the next target within a few days to keep the direction alive. With that said, if you want this document along with this training, then make sure to join the free community from the link in the description. If you want to work with me one-on-one, make sure to book a call from the link in the description. And if you want weekly newsletters on improving in every aspect of your life, meaning health, wealth, love, and self, then make sure to join the newsletter again from the link in the description. With that said, thank you for being here. I hope this was valuable. If it was, let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and I'll see you in the next one.